Hello, everyone, and welcome to this month's episode of RATV. Today, we're going to start with a quick COVID update. In the therapeutic space, we'll talk about the most recent data on antivirals, and in the world of vaccines, we'll discuss the latest on boosters. Afterwards, we'll take you behind the scenes at TechAtlas, RA Capital's science and research focused team. We'll talk to some current TechAtlas associates, as well as those who have moved on to other teams within RA, like the equity and venture teams. We're going to touch on what it's like to prepare to meet with a company, how to understand and map competitive landscapes, and what goes into making an investment decision. Before we begin, an important reminder, RA Capital is an investment firm that is regulated by the SEC. Nothing that we talk about during the webcast should be taken as investment advice. So let's get into it. I'll first introduce our COVID team, Peter, Mike, and Katie, who will take us through the COVID update for this month. Please take it away, team.
Thanks, Tom. Yeah, as Tom mentioned, we'll be kicking off the COVID update. I'm going to be briefly talking about some exciting new data in the therapeutic space, and then I'll hand it off to Mike and Katie, and they'll give us kind of our latest thinking on the booster landscape. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Hope everyone can see that. So we got some really exciting data last Friday. There's this molecule called molnupiravir from Merck, which is an oral polymerase inhibitor that had been being tested in a phase 3 trial. And this phase 3 was really significant because it was probably going to be the first phase 3 data set that we would have from a potentially compelling molecule. And we were expecting the study to be positive. We were hoping that was going to be positive, and indeed, the study was positive. This was super exciting because it was the first, oral antiviral which was decidedly positive in a large phase 3 trial for outpatient COVID. And so we found it really exciting. And I'm going to walk you through briefly some of the data from the Merck press release. And at a high level, they were looking at what percent of patients would be hospitalized or died within the first month. And in the molnupiravir arm, about 7% of patients were either hospitalized or died, whereas in the placebo arm, about 14% of patients were hospitalized or died. And so that equates to a roughly 48% relative risk reduction in hospitalization or death, which is awesome in and of itself. And then if you look at just deaths, there was 0 in the molnupiravir arm and I believe 8 in the placebo arm. And so that equates to obviously 100% relative risk reduction in death, which is definitely compelling and very exciting. And so again, this was just an interim analysis, but hopefully, in the coming weeks and coming months, we'll get the full data. So I guess the question is, this isn't the first phase 3 trial in the outpatient setting. Of course, we've had the antibodies and we've had a phase 3 from remdesivir. This was just the first oral positive phase 3 trial. And so the question is, how does molnupiravir stack up against the other options, namely remdesivir and the antibodies? And to answer that question, I'm going to go to the efficacy chart that I borrowed from our map, which you can check out on our website. And here we're looking at large phase 2 and phase 3 studies of the different antibodies. So you have Lilly, Regeneron, Vir, and then Gilead down here with remdesivir. And we're looking at a very similar primary endpoint. It's hospitalization or death. And what you'll notice is that the relative risk reduction is consistently between 70 and 85%. And so that is definitely compelling. And remember from the previous slide, molnupiravir came in around 48%. And so, our kind of initial conclusion was that while molnupiravir has the efficacy the convenience advantage because it's oral, the antibodies and remdesivir do seem to have more profound clinical efficacy. And one other thing that I'll add is that we're still waiting on data from a symptoms endpoint from the molnupiravir phase 3 data. And we're hoping to see that not only did the treated patients, end up in the hospital at a far lower rate, but they also recovered faster. And so instead of recovering in 6 days, for example, you could recover in 3 days. So that is basically at a very high level, the molnupiravir data that we got last week. And then I also wanted to talk about the another phase 3 data set that we got last week from Gilead's remdesivir. And now remember, remdesivir is Gilead's drug, and it's an IV polymerase inhibitor. So pretty similar mechanism to Merck's molnupiravir. But the big difference is that it has to be given IV because it's not orally bioavailable. And so this is one of the first drugs that was approved or authorized for COVID-19 in the hospitalized setting last year when COVID first started. And the data there was positive in some trials, but more mixed in others. And it was pretty controversial whether how well the drug was actually working. But Gilead ended up running a phase 3 trial in the outpatient setting. And now this makes a lot of sense because we know antivirals work better the earlier you give them. And so it makes sense to go earlier in the disease course. And we finally got this phase 3 outpatient data set. It did take a while because, and actually the enrollment was halted early because it's an IV infusion that has to be given every over the course of 3 days. And so it's not very competitive with the antibodies, which are, a single IV infusion. And so they did have trouble recruiting it, but they did enroll around 500 patients in the end. And we just got the data Friday. And this is the primary endpoint, hospitalization or death, very similar to the antibodies or the molnupiravir endpoint. And what I'll call your attention to is this 87% reduction. And so this was from the previous slide down here. And so clearly the efficacy was pretty much in line with the antibodies. Now, one thing that was surprising about this data set, though, is that there was no apparent effect on viral load. And this is surprising because, one would think that the mechanism of an antiviral is, to decrease the viral load. That's how it works. But very shockingly, there was no difference on this endpoint. And it really wasn't clear why not. This was presented at ID Week, which is an infectious disease conference last week. And I think everyone's pretty surprised at this result, and the presenter didn't really have a good answer as to what could explain this finding. And this is particularly kind of weird when you put this data, the viral load data, up against the Lilly and the Regeneron antibodies. And this is what we were expecting the viral load curves to look like. But for some reason, there was no difference, even though the clinical efficacy, the hospitalization and death endpoint looked just as good as the antibodies. And so, yeah, this is kind of a ongoing mystery, but hopefully we'll have more data soon to understand kind of this discrepancy. And so with that, I will stop sharing my screen and hand it back to Mike and Katie.
Thanks, Peter. Those are some great updates in therapeutic space. I feel like we haven't touched upon those in a couple of months now. So yeah, we just have a few quick updates to give in the vaccine space. We've had some noteworthy meetings from the CDC and FDA recently on their feelings on when and for whom boosters should be made available. So Mike, you want to give us a quick update on what's come out of those regulatory meetings?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Katie. So I guess I'll start off with Pfizer, because if you've been following the news, obviously, they recently had an EUA for their booster, but it was in a narrower population than they were seeking initially. So as some background, there were a few meetings over the last couple of weeks by both the VRBPAC and the ACIP groups, their expert vaccine panels, to discuss the booster and all the implications. And so, originally Pfizer was seeking that the booster be authorized in all adults, but the ultimate decision was to authorize the booster in just a few subgroups. So adults over the age of 65, or those who are at high risk of severe COVID. And that was either just from age or due to institutional or occupational exposure. So healthcare workers, people working in nursing homes, et cetera. And I guess, the bottom line here is that the primary concern and the reason why the population was narrowed was due to risk of myocarditis, which we've talked about in previous episodes, but I guess just as a quick refresher, it's inflammation of the heart. It's seen more often after the second dose of mRNA vaccines. And it's usually mild. It's symptomatic, but generally after symptoms subside, patients can kind of go back to their normal daily life. So it's usually not complicated. But as with anything with the heart, I think it's, a reasonable cause for concern. And a note here is that it's primarily in young adult males, and it's about at a rate of 1 in 5,000. So still relatively rare, but out of an abundance of caution, the experts saw it as grounds to hold off on authorizing it in all young adults. So that's the main concern. There are a few other concerns brought up by the panels, including just lack of the quantity of data for boosting with Pfizer and other vaccines. There was also the issue brought up, what's the incremental benefit of a third booster dose when transmission in the US is being primarily driven by the unvaccinated? So, the benefit of third dose would be to reduce, the disease burden in those that are already vaccinated. But does that have the greatest public health benefit when there are still these unclear safety risks? So yeah, those are some of the concerns, but by and large, myocarditis was kind of the star of the show for these panels. And obviously, we know the results. The FDA came out and issued this EUA for the subgroups that I mentioned. But then just today, speaking of myocarditis, there was I just recently saw that Sweden actually halted the use of Moderna, which is also an mRNA vaccine as Pfizer is, so the same modality, in people that are under the age of 30. And then Denmark quickly followed after with a news release saying that they're restricting Moderna for anyone under 18. And I guess the word on the street, this is also related to the risk of myocarditis, although we don't really have full information on why these halts are happening. So I guess what I'm saying is we're seeing myocarditis coming up as a major concern, and this is in the primary vaccination series, so not just for boosters. So it's definitely something that we're not done hearing about. But speaking of Moderna and boosters, Katie, I've been talking about Pfizer's booster, but what can you tell us about the recent developments for the other boosters such as J&J and Moderna?
Yeah, so Moderna and J&J are both a little bit behind Pfizer in being approved for given authorization for boosters, but both have submitted to the FDA. And I think we can expect similar outcomes once those meetings finally happen. Moderna, the FDA is supposed to meet on Moderna next week on October 14th, and then on October 15th, they're going to meet on J&J. And so Moderna has actually submitted for a half dose. So with a 50 microgram dose of their vaccine, which is half of the 100 microgram that was given for each of the first 2 doses in the prime immunization series. And, after 6 months, they were seeing waning neutralizing antibody levels. And so it seems like there's the need for a booster shot. With this 50 microgram half dose, they saw a 23-fold increase in the neutralizing antibody levels. So it brought it back up significantly higher than where they had been after that second shot. And in terms of how the FDA will read into the 50 microgram data, we don't know. It seems like from what they've been showing with their neutralizing antibody titer levels, it's working as a booster and it's working well, but they will likely want to see how a 100 microgram dose would compare to see which elicits a longer, more durable immune response. Whereas for the company, you know, and the world, if 50 microgram dose were to be authorized, that would open up a lot more doses to get more people those boosters in reserve for those who still need primary immunization as well. And then, like I mentioned with J&J, the FDA will meet next week as well to discuss their booster dose, and recall that J&J is just a single shot for the primary immunization. So this would just be a second shot. And they've looked at both boosting at 2 months and at 6 months. And they have real world data from the 2-month boost from a phase 3 trial that showed a booster at 2 months provided 94% protection against symptomatic COVID in the US, and 75% protection against symptomatic disease globally, which compare this to around the 66% they saw with just that single shot. And it also demonstrated a 4-fold increase in neutralizing antibody titer levels, whereas, so with the 6-month boost, they don't have real world data available yet, but they saw that gave a 12-fold increase in the neutralizing antibody levels. So there might be reason to believe that waiting for after those 6 months is going to elicit a stronger immune response. And I think those are all the updates we have to give on the COVID vaccines and booster doses and what's going on right now. So I think we can turn it back over to you, Tom, and the panel for a day in the life at TechAtlas.
Thanks. I'll introduce Jess, who will start leading our panel for, a day in the life at TechAtlas.
Hi, everybody. I'm so happy to introduce our 5 panelists here, all of whom have worked in our TechAtlas group here at RA. We have Ruz Riahi, an associate here, Shan Wang, a senior associate, Laura Stoppel, a member of our equity team, Dan Marks, a member of our venture team, and Alyssa Larson, who is in TechAtlas management. And before we jump into the panel, I'll give you a little background on TechAtlas. So TechAtlas is the science and research focused arm of RA Capital. It was actually created as its own unit within RA with its own name to allow separation between the fundamental diligence that we do on companies and the heat and sense of accountability that often comes with making that investment decision. There are situations in which you can get all the fundamental analysis right and then get an eventual investment wrong. For example, maybe valuation is too high, maybe you failed to win an allocation in the deal, or there were issues with the way management handled a good drug candidate. TechAtlas offers training and exposure to these variables, but it doesn't make associates who often join the firm directly following their PhD personally accountable for getting them right. That's on the investment team, who they closely partner with. So to kick this off, we will start with Shan and Ruz, who are associates here on TechAtlas. So maybe let's start with Shan. Shan, will you summarize the therapeutic areas you cover and your near-term goals?
Great, yeah, just to give some background, it's great to meet everyone. My name is Shan Wang, and I'm a senior associate at TechAtlas, where, as Jess outlined really well, we do a lot of the scientific diligence, the fundamental due diligence together with the venture and equity teams to ultimately get to a yes. I joined the firm 2 years ago, coming from that academic background. My PhD was in neuroscience, but since joining the firm, I've primarily worked in a lot of different orphan disease spaces, which include various gene therapies. Last year, I covered a lot of vaccines and sort of near-term goals. Ultimately, I want to be comfortable working in any sort of biotech space I come across, and TechAtlas has really given me the opportunity to have that diverse range of coverage. And so more recently, I'm picking up the language of oncology, which my colleague Ruz is very well versed in already.
Awesome. Thanks, Shan. Ruz, would you like to introduce yourself, summarize therapeutic areas you cover and your near-term goals as well?
Yeah, thanks, Jess and Shan. So hey, everyone, I'm Ruz. Thanks for everyone for joining. As Shan said, I cover oncology. I've been at RA for a little over 3 years, mostly focused on solid tumors. So from kidney cancer to lung cancer, ovarian cancer, and the likes, and broadly cover immuno-oncology, which is, if you're familiar with the immuno-oncology landscape, even just a little bit, it's really broad. There are a ton of different ways you can target a tumor using the immune system. So focus my time really covering, things from immunocytokines, to immune exhaustion markers, things like that. So yeah, and I think in terms of kind of where I'm taking my career, oncology is a huge landscape. There's a lot of unmet need. There are a lot of great ideas and a lot of bad ideas, and I think it would be nice to think about the next big thing in oncology using kind of like a venture lens. So yeah, it's kind of what I do at RA in a nutshell.
Very cool. Yeah, thanks for sharing. One question we get all the time is, how does an associate spend their day? And so if we can jump back to Shan, if you wouldn't mind projecting a slide and walking us through a day in your life, what does your schedule look like?
Sure, happy to. And let me know if that's being displayed properly. I think it is. Yeah, so, this is definitely a question that we get pretty often. And so we thought the best way just to do that would be to take a snapshot of a day I have coming up and then walk through all the components. So there is a lot of blue here, but I think everything can really be broken down into 3 parts. So first key, as you can see on the top and the bottom, are the PR scans that every associate does in the morning and in the afternoon. Second, we have a handful of external company meetings. And then third, we have another handful of internal company meetings. And I'll just take everyone through each block just to give a high level description. And of course, happy to answer questions as they come up. And so I started off talking about the PR scans in the morning. And, as an associate, one of our core fundamental roles is to be on the lookout for press releases and news in our areas of coverage, specifically looking out for actionable items. And so I can give an example of that. So I mentioned earlier, I cover vaccines. And let's say this hypothetical company, private company A, comes out with really compelling phase 2 booster data in a vaccine space. As the associate working in that area of coverage, it's then my job to come out with a press release response where I communicate to the rest of the team the so what message, what's awesome and compelling about these data. And then beyond just summarizing the data, communicating that awesome so what, it's then also my role to follow up with the next actionable items. And so to recommend a course of action, which usually falls in line with attending the press release conference and setting up a meeting with that company immediately, let's say private company A, so that if this is really compelling and awesome, we want to invest immediately, we can have all of our due diligence teed up and tied up so we can move quickly for this opportunity. So that's just sort of one example. There's also actionable news when the news is not compelling, for instance, because that might have maybe we don't want to invest now, but that has read-throughs for some other areas of similar coverage if the targets are the same, or maybe that means that company is going to pivot to their next to lead item, and we want to be in that conversation the day that news comes out, so we have a seat at the table for any other sort of things that pop up. So that sort of covers at a high level what the press release scans are for in the morning and the afternoons. Next, I mentioned a series of external company meetings. I already gave one scenario of what one type of company meeting is like for that when we reach out in response to actionable news. There are other types of company meetings we take. For instance, the company might actually reach out to us when they are kickstarting a fundraising round, or if they're testing the waters and they want to go public. So those will come through our internal channels, and then we'll schedule a meeting to learn more about this opportunity and see what the next steps that make sense are to follow through. And then a third type of company meeting I would say is, let's say I'm covering a new space. I get thrown into a random oncology space and I want to get up to speed quickly. One of the best ways of doing that is to actually speak to the experts in the space. So the companies who have been working on this for years, especially if we haven't met with them in the last 6 months, just to get up to speed on where they're at, trying to learn what makes that company compelling, to see if there's actually an investment opportunity here. So everything we do, especially with external meetings, is through the lens of getting to a yes on an investment, which is a really good segue. So I mentioned the third component of my schedule is a bunch of internal meetings. And so that's getting to the yes, my Electron Cloud check-in, and my venture debrief project. And I would say that's because one of the core features of being an associate is that it's a highly collaborative role. We interact a lot with the different groups within RA. So that's the investment team, the venture team, operations, other groups. And because we interact so much, we have to have direct and frequent lines of communication. And so one way that we communicate regularly with the investment team is every Friday morning, we have a getting to the yes meeting where we debrief on all the company meetings I outlined that we take in the week before, just to get feedback on what the next steps should be to get to a yes or a pass. These meetings have also recently not been repurposed, but added a new functionality where we call them Shark Tank pitches, where the associates, we ourselves, go out and look for some opportunities, particularly in the public realm, that we might not have taken the company meeting, but we've just been looking out on the landscape and identified maybe opportunities under the radar, and then we ourselves pitch them in a Shark Tank style to the investment team. So that's getting to the yes. And then similarly, with the venture team, although it's more specific to the particular project that we're working on, we do have regular debrief sessions where we make sure that we're all aligned on milestones for internal diligence there. And then the last thing I'll touch upon for my day-to-day schedule is I do have these updates. They're called Electron Cloud check-ins, because as an associate, the role can be really transitory in that even as an associate, we have the opportunity to focus in on particular aspects of the job that we enjoy to grow into that role. And so coming in, I've been really interested in working from the public markets perspective. So I communicated that interest to my manager, and I was given the opportunity to work on Electron Cloud team, where we associates are electrons that orbit around investment principles or nucleuses. And basically, we learn about what it takes to get a deal done beyond just the scientific diligence. And that could be via special diligence projects or listening into the conversations beyond just the back and forth with KOLs and the scientific part of that conversation. So yeah, that's a very, I guess, high level take of a day in the life of me. And I can stop sharing my screen and pass it on to Ruse for
yeah, I don't know how much more I'm going to be able to add there.
Totally fine. Ruse, if you could share a little bit about your day. Yeah, that would be great. Yeah. And if Shan already covered something, feel free to just, take whatever high level perspective.
No, I think Shan definitely outlined everything really well. Yeah, I'd just like to reiterate the morning news and stock flow or stock movements. It's huge for our investment team and our traders to make sure that we're acting on information that could be really useful for not just the company itself that's trading, for example, on positive data, but that might impact an investment opportunity or a current portfolio position. So being able to react quickly and communicate that high-level analysis and the next action item, which is, hey, we're going to dive into this, meet with a company and kind of get more color, is a huge part of our day. The only one thing I wanted to add is, like I have this biweekly commercial team meeting, and it just kind of goes to show you how many different flavors of opportunities there are within RA. So just like focusing on venture is one thing, or on the public side, but then also commercial stage companies, right? So that's a really interesting thing to kind of be a part of right now for my day-to-day. And then the other thing that's different here is SITC conference. So the big part of being an associate is attending scientific conferences. Some are larger than others, some are more action-packed, some are a lot more kind of just preclinical stage, not a lot of stock moving or clinical data level things. And yeah, so this one is really nice to just like put together a game plan of the thousands of abstracts that are going to come out. Which one of these are going to be stock moving? Which ones should we prepare scenario analyses for? If the data is going to be good, the stock can trade up to this much, and kind of relaying that often and early to the investment team is a huge part of conference planning. So yeah, SITC is coming up, so it'll be a good one. I think like that's kind of I don't know if I have much more to add, but that's kind of a day in the life for me, at least on the oncology team. So yeah, I'll pass it back to you, Jess.
Awesome. Yeah, maybe Ruse, you could tell us then what about your job do you like the most?
That's a hard question. I hate cancer, but I love working in oncology. I think it's difficult because you want these things to really work, and just having the humility to kind of take data as they come and be unbiased in your analysis is probably my favorite part, is just like really being what's the word? Just being like really real about what the data is and what it's telling us, right? Because at the end of the day, it's impacting patients. And if we're going to make an investment in a company, there has to be scientific conviction that this is working. And I think just using that as a guiding kind of principle for me as I do my work is pretty big. So yeah, and I think the other thing is really just the wealth of opportunities within oncology, but also just in the broader disease landscapes that we cover here at RA. We're constantly exposed to really, really cool technologies and platforms and companies and operators and people in the industry that are really devoting their lives to medicine. So I think, those two are probably my favorite parts of the job. It's always fresh every day. It's something different, new company, new approach. We thought, we had a handle on PD-1, right? And those antibodies are doing well, but then there's a whole wealth of new opportunities in terms of augmenting PD-1 and all that. So sorry about the siren. Yeah, that's kind of my favorite part of the job. Yeah.
I'd love to, it sounds like a lot of your day goes into meeting with companies and also prepping to meet with companies. And I'd love to ask Alyssa, as associate director nowadays, you've been in a lot of those meetings, I'm sure, and you've also trained a couple of associates by now on what goes into those meetings. So what goes on in those meetings and how do you prep for them? Why do you spend so much time on them?
Yeah, I mean, I think either Ruse or Shan are both kind of highlighted, we're an investment firm. We're trying to find awesome companies that have incredible technologies that are going to make improvements in patients' lives. And you kind of have to, I don't want to say kiss a lot of frogs, but you have to meet with a lot of companies who maybe are in different stages of development and have maybe different levels of compelling evidence. And so making sure that when you enter those meetings, you're well prepared to ask the questions that are most important, understanding what is the unmet need, does the company propose to fix a problem that might not be there if you discuss with physicians? That's something that you really want to make sure that you are addressing. What is the quality of the evidence that they're presenting? That's a huge part of the TechAtlas associates, and I think that's why we typically hire folks who have pretty significant background understanding science. Like almost all of our associates have PhDs, and that kind of goes into just being able to really rigorously analyze data and understand, was the question that they're asking the most appropriate one? Do the data that they present actually support, the conclusions that they're saying? So spending time beforehand, usually if you're meeting with a public company, you can sort of review their materials that they've publicly disclosed beforehand and, really understanding based on kind of the narrative that they put together, what kind of questions are going to help you understand whether this is a truly awesome opportunity, or if, maybe it's not quite awesome yet and I need to see XYZ to really get excited. That's paramount, because if you just go into a meeting unprepared, you're not going to be able to kind of come out of that meeting with a good feel of, can we get to yes? Can we make an investment here? So that's kind of why it's important. And I think, just all the things that I said about, kind of doing the work up front, the way that we have sort of structured TechAtlas is we do, we make it so that different associates kind of have these domain areas where they really are the subject matter expert. And that's not to say that they can't take a meeting outside of their space, but when a company with a rare hematologic disease comes through, like Shan knows those. And so we're going to leverage Shan's expertise so that she doesn't have to necessarily get up to speed. She already knows what the unmet needs are. She knows what physicians want and what they're looking for. And so she can, maybe review the data that the company has presented and then, come to a conclusion after that meeting of, hey, is this awesome? And should we, maybe do more work? Should we, kind of what should the game plan be going forward? And is this an investable company? So I hope that answered your question, Tom.
Yeah, for sure.
I love that. Yeah. And along with that, so one question we often get in our nano course, so our Capital teaches this business of biotechnology course. And a question we get all the time in that course along these lines are, what do investors care about? Sometimes it can feel like companies and investors are speaking two different languages. And when companies pitch investors, they often walk away from those meetings and they say, well, I don't know what to think about what just happened. And so maybe Laura, can you shed some light on, what makes an opportunity an investable opportunity?
Absolutely. A first meeting with a company is so critical because it's the company's job to really convey the opportunity to the investment team. Oftentimes, you might only get an hour with the team. So, putting the key information that we need in order to decide to do more work in this opportunity or perhaps wait until X, Y, and Z happens, it's critical to convey that. And that includes everything from, what is the unmet need that you're trying to solve? What is the size of the market that you're going after? And how much capital is it going to take to get to major inflection points? If you pitch that you're not raising enough to get there, it's probably going to be very difficult for us to want to invest at this point in time because there's not obvious value creation that's going to happen with that capital. So it's really important to kind of address all of the key elements that go into an investment for us. And that can be accomplished quite succinctly within an hour meeting. And that's what we're looking for from companies. I'll say to build off the answer that Alyssa gave to the prior question as well, certainly building relationships with companies and management teams is so critical. It's a major objective of these meetings. We might not be able to get to a yes to invest now, but that doesn't mean that we won't, when you come up with that key data set that we're looking at or the next round at a different valuation, and building a relationship and making sure that the company knows that we're genuine in our interests is important. As Shanshan mentioned, oftentimes when data comes out after a PR in the morning, we want to get on the phone with the company to ask questions in real time. If we've already, made that relationship with management, we're more likely to get a meeting sooner than some of the other funds. So it's something that we take very seriously.
Yes.
I was just going to add something to what Laura said here really quickly, if that's okay. Like, one of the things that we're trained on as associates is to not be afraid of ideas that might seem fringe, because an opportunity that might need a little bit more love or structure kind of around it could be a good fit for our venture team, but also keeping a good relationship with that company when they come around with exciting new information or data, something that us associates can analyze, quickly relay to someone on the investment team like Laura, and then they can work with us to kind of making a decision as to whether or not we're ready to get to yes there. So yeah, I just wanted to add that.
Yeah. So, obviously all of you are dealing with a lot of data all the time, both in a very quantitative form in whatever data studies you're reading most lately, but also all this information about each individual company. So maybe Dan, could you speak to a little bit about how you communicate, how you organize between teams, all this information?
Yeah, no, this is obviously incredibly important as RAs continue to grow with many more people, and making sure that we communicate among the different teams that we have, the venture team, the equity team, and TechAtlas. So typically, at least pre-COVID times, after a meeting, we would, and even during COVID times now, we jump on a Zoom or something like that, but we would circle up after a meeting and talk about what are our key questions, what are the next steps, and then we would try to make sure that we record that in our internal note-taking system, RMS, and that's really important. Many times I've looked back at either old notes from myself or notes from colleagues, and as Laura mentioned, we're often establishing relationships with companies over a long period of time. And it's super helpful to be able to go back and get a summary of what the company was, where the company was, even a year or two in the past. And so, those notes are fantastic. Then we also have our maps, as you probably all know, where we try to, on TechAtlas, really contextualize all of what's going on in a given space and visually lay it out and be able to sort of communicate in a visual manner which companies, which approaches are really exciting and how they're differentiated from others. And so that's another great way that I still use. I still pull up maps today to see, where, what are all the approaches being tried in a given space and how they compare. So those are some of the approaches that we use to try to make sure we communicate effectively across the team.
Great, yeah.
And there's one principle when I think about RA communication that we love to cite over and over and over again. It has its own acronym. Maybe Shanshan, do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, so
Exactly. And to add on to Dan's answer, and the point I think you're hinting at is at RA, we've basically developed our own language to help communicate across these teams. We use a lot of acronyms. The key acronym for the so what message that we've all been talking about when you have a data set and you're trying to analyze it and communicating that is the BLAT, the bottom line at the top, where we summarize basically the key learnings at the very top, bolded and highlighted in yellow. So, unlike academic publications where you have the introduction and all of the background at the beginning and the conclusions at the very bottom, we do it the flip. We have the punchline at the very top, and then we can go into the details just to efficiently communicate. And then, of course, we have we basically learn this language with the team through osmosis. We have the BLAT, we have the bolding and the highlighting. We have various other acronyms like thinking through the framework of all of our investments as unconscionable to deny drugs for unconscionable diseases. And just over time, we build up that language.
Yeah.
And,
Please.
Sorry. Oftentimes, people will look at our team page and see scientific writers on there, and it's a less common role at an investment fund, and that's really critical because we do have such a large team, and onboarding new associates is so critical. We have a lot of help with the communication effort and making sure that everyone speaks that common language.
Absolutely. And of course, sometimes everything kind of comes to a head all at once. So that can be in the form of a big news story, which we've already talked about to a certain extent, but also conferences, which at least we get a heads up about. And I know, Ruz, you just participated in a pretty major conference. Could you talk a little bit about what we do to prep for that kind of thing, how we, quantify so many abstracts and whatnot?
Yeah, no, it's probably one of the busiest times of the year. And unfortunately for oncology, there are like 6 or 7 major conferences that start from the beginning of the year to the end. I think the way we do it is really just an all-team approach where we know the subject matter experts who cover specifics, let's say solid tumors. When we get that triage, that like big list of abstracts, we work together to triage them based on priority as to whether this is going to be stock moving data or if this is just of interest for us. And so that helps us kind of narrow it down. And I think, big, just pulling on the communicating piece with Invest and other teams at RA, we try to communicate often and early, a month out from the conference to say, hey, we went through the list of different titles that are coming out. Here are the 20 that we think are going to be super stock moving. Here are a couple that might be of interest for, another company or two that we're looking at. So that's kind of how we do it. And yeah, so the team is big, right? We have, I think for ESMO, we sent probably like 10 or 11 people. It was virtual, but just being on a team that large just makes your day easier. And if you need help, you're juggling 2 things that are coming out at the same time, having a larger team kind of helps that bandwidth constraint. So I think I don't know if that covers it though.
No, absolutely. I think.
Yeah.
Great. Well, moving on to therapeutic areas, everyone's mentioned that they've covered a variety of different therapeutic areas within their time at RA. And Alyssa, as an associate director in TechAtlas, maybe you could chat a little bit about what it's like to coach someone to learn a new therapeutic area and what it was like for you yourself to go from, because usually when we have someone join TechAtlas, they don't get assigned the space that they studied for their PhD.
That's very correct. And I'd like to point out that my first space was orphan mitochondrial disorders. And I knew what a mitochondria was. I knew powerhouse of the cell, I think from basic high school biology. But yeah, I was coming in with a chemistry PhD. So it took me a minute to kind of get used to the genetics that are associated there. But no, you're right, Jess. We do want people to sort of broaden their horizons when they come to RA and learn about new spaces because, especially in the case when they've done a PhD or maybe a medical degree, they already know a lot about a particular area. We can leverage them for that, but why not learn a totally new place? And it can be daunting. I think I'm probably still trying to figure it out. I think I covered several different spaces and each time I might've had a slightly different approach. And I know Mike on the call, he and I were just talking about this because, he's covered, in addition to COVID, which he does an incredible job on, he's covered orphan neuromuscular diseases diseases, and now he's getting up to speed on orphan extracellular conditions. And I think, his strategy for covering those different areas has, evolved. But I would say, one of the things that I think that RA does great is obviously we have a lot of different resources. In order to help people get up to speed. I think, there's no substitute for really kind of just digging into the scientific literature and understanding about, the etiology of a disease, understanding about the prevalence and, like we talked about before, unmet need. We have databases that we can go to learn about, how are physicians treating diseases. We have databases that pull all of the drugs in development for different diseases. And I think by learning about those drugs, that is a great way to learn about the disease in a way. Sort of the culmination of understanding an entire landscape at RA is creating these competitive landscape maps. And so I don't think that there's like one way, there's no one right way to kind of tackle the competitive landscape map. I'm sure if you asked every single person on this call, they might have taken a different approach. But in general, I mean, it's really just, learning about the disease, learning about the assets in development, talking with companies like we talked about, people come through and have these assets in development and they can help us learn about sort of the nuances of the disease, going to conferences and learning about the cutting edge research that, has to do with these different diseases. I just, attended the ASBMR conference, the Bone Mineral Society conference. And, in addition to looking at data for a disease that we're very interested in, hypoparathyroidism, I also, looked at a bunch of natural history papers and tried to understand, different, posters that covered that. So it is a bit of drinking from the fire hose, and there's no one strategy, but I think that, we, through kind of the way that we look at investing, you sort of just learn about these diseases, and also talking to physicians is a great way that, another resource that we have to try to understand, what is going on with, immuno-oncology, Ruth. Like, go talk to a bunch of the preeminent docs and understand, what are the most exciting things. What animal models are predictive, in IO. Unfortunately, I don't think that's really the case. But for other diseases, for example, maybe Mike can talk to docs and see how predictive, DMD mouse models are. But yeah, it's really just kind of digging into the science, talking to the experts, and then also generating kind of your own conviction once you've had a chance to evaluate all those different programs that are in development.
Great, yeah. And I mean, once you get all that expertise settled, stuff comes up, I'm sure. And I'm sure Shan knows something about that, because I know you've done a good amount of work in the COVID space now. So I wonder, Shan, what was it like pivoting overnight sometime in mid-March 2020 to COVID?
Just really quickly, Shan used to send so many emails. I felt pretty bad.
I see you've been flooding your email
such a great
box.
job. Yeah.
Thank you. I think at least from my experience in with COVID vaccines, so I will say my background was in neurobiology, like I mentioned. My first map, unrelated to neurobiology, orphan heme, and then vaccines, unrelated to any of that. But I think some of the points, just building off of other people's answers so far, for me, the switch, it was really, I felt very well supported in that at RA we have a ton of resources really geared towards just getting up to speed quickly in this space. And for me, it was like a very exciting opportunity because it was the first time I felt like I was working on something that was really, really imminently important, not just for myself, but just for like everyone, because we all cared about the core answers of, what are the best vaccines? When are we going to get these vaccines? How many doses are we going to get? And what does like a good immune response look at like? So building that competitive landscape, it was a bit of a different experience than my first map, which I had taken on a map that was already made, a legacy map made by Dan Marks, who's actually on this call as well. But starting off, at least on a new map, it was starting off with these key diligence questions and then building the structure and the competitive landscape around them. Just which vaccine programs we thought would hit upon all the key points and be successful in all different aspects. So it was a busy time, but definitely grateful I had that experience. And I see that I flooded a lot of people's inboxes during COVID.
They were great because I didn't know where to turn for information, Shan, so your emails were super helpful. I'm sure they were helpful for a lot of people.
Yeah, and we made a map. Our TechAtlas team put together a COVID map. It's still, I think, being updated. We have, I think, vaccines and therapeutics and maybe even devices as well, all up on, you can find it at racap.com/COVID-19. It's just the COVID-19 section of our website.
Oh, and I just wanted to add, that reminds me, I wanted to add one more thing to my answer, in that working on COVID, I think it was a big shift for RA too, in that it was the first time we were so interactive with the biotech community, just through these venues, like having these communications and real-time conversations about vaccines, about therapeutics, about diagnostics, and just being the opportunity to be more transparent. Outreach was really fun.
Great.
Yeah, no, it's been great to have that interface. Both that's what our ATV came out of, and then publishing our maps, of course, on the website. Well, maybe let's talk a little bit more about the way TechAtlas interacts with the venture team and the equity team. So maybe let's start with Dan. Dan, can you tell us what it was like coming from the TechAtlas team and joining the venture team? Then a little bit about what the venture team does and how venture and TechAtlas interact.
Sure. So yeah, coming, I guess, from academia, from my PhD program over to TechAtlas, then from TechAtlas to the venture team, there are many things that I've learned. I guess one of the key things specific to venture is that where we deal a lot with sort of early stage science and preclinical development. Often in graduate school, you're reading papers and you get really excited about cool new science, and I feel like at RA, what really was important for me to learn were all the different types of risks that exist in sort of translating that science into an effective therapy, and sort of understanding biology risk. People have talked about today, translatability of preclinical models, chemistry risk, and getting a clean molecule with good drug-like properties, competitive risk, market risk, things like that. And so really it was just sort of adding that lens, was that sort of investor lens to what my radar for exciting science was something key that I learned sort of that on TechAtlas. And then also even if we're building companies from scratch, you do want to have some view of what the company would be worth down the line, and by being on TechAtlas and getting to look at a huge variety of companies at different stages of development, you get to understand a bit about how companies are valued at different stages. And then, just getting that deep understanding of different spaces. I covered rare disease and some of the spaces that Chan mentioned, and then moved over to oncology, and getting that deep understanding of what has worked, what hasn't worked in the clinic has been super helpful for now when we're working with portfolio companies after we've made an investment to give them strategic advice on based on our understanding of the space. And then maybe the last thing I'll talk about is learning how to communicate effectively an investment thesis, and understanding, sort of having that shared background and knowledge of what are other companies that have come before and why we believe that this company will be successful, and being able to communicate that effectively was something that was really important to learn, and that I learned on the TechAtlas team. In terms of how TechAtlas and venture work together, we obviously leverage the immense expertise and experience that TechAtlas has, that TechAtlas associates have within their different areas of coverage. And so if we're looking at an opportunity in a given space, we'll loop in the appropriate associate, and they'll often help really lead the scientific diligence for those companies. And then I mentioned, we work with our portfolio companies and companies that we've invested in to sort of, help with strategic questions and prioritize indications and things like that. And that's something that TechAtlas helps with. And then lastly, and importantly, TechAtlas, we sort of map out all the approaches that different groups are taking, but we also come to understand the white spaces, places that we think, potentially, why isn't somebody doing something in this given space with a given approach? And that can be that insight can be turned into, even new companies. And so one of our former colleagues, Ben Dake, used to cover PAH on TechAtlas, and then eventually joined the venture team, and due to his deep expertise in that space, had an idea for why isn't someone taking this approach, and did it himself essentially through RA, founded this new company, and has since gone on to join that company around this new idea that came about by his his deep understanding of the space. So TechAtlas associates also are really important for idea generation and differentiated insights into new therapeutic approaches.
Yeah, and Laura, I wonder if you can talk about similarly for the equity team. How does the equity team work with TechAtlas, and generally, how does equity compare and contrast with the venture team?
Absolutely. And I realize that, many people on this call might not know how we define equity. So kind of the delineation between venture and equity at RA, my team, the equity team, covers essentially everything on the private side, Series A with the team in place, so the public markets. And Dan's team is much more largely focused on new company creation, maybe taking ideas, building a team, in licensing IP or assets. So, we leverage TechAtlas in actually a quite similar way. Oftentimes it's to help us do diligence on companies, either on the private side or the public side. On the private side, it's really great to have the bandwidth that TechAtlas allows us to have in terms of covering everything, because there's a lot of companies in that wedge of biotech that I just mentioned. And at least on the private side, oftentimes an investment requires going under CDA, taking a look at very extensive data rooms, doing diligence with key opinion leaders, regulatory diligence, IP diligence. There's, a ton of things that go into the process. From first meeting with a company to making an investment. And TechAtlas is critical in knowing that and allows us to have that bandwidth and breadth to be able to look at everything. On the public side, and Shanshan, mentioned the early morning PRs and news that's coming out in real time. We really depend on TechAtlas to help us triage news coming out. Oftentimes we're prepared for it. We're expecting it. We've created scenario analyses, and we already have kind of a trading plan in place. I would say 50% of the time, no matter how many scenarios we anticipate could happen, something else happens. And, we need to adapt our actions in real time. So we really depend on having that domain expertise at our fingertips in order to do that. So, we work very closely, and associates even have the opportunity to follow the investment from the beginning to the end. We, had a couple of associates join the investment team meeting this morning to help us discuss some of the opportunities that we've been actively diligencing. So, the investment team would not exist in the capacity it does today without TechAtlas. They're really critical for everything that we do. And was there another question in there, Tom, that I haven't answered yet?
No, you got them both. Just kind of define equity versus venture, which you already handled.
Yeah, no, that was great. I mean, so we're close to time. We will wrap up maybe by asking Alyssa about, given that you're in TechAtlas management and thinking about what qualities make someone a successful associate or research assistant, what does a successful applicant look like, and what do associates go on and do with their careers?
Yeah, so I think, first and foremost, because we are, investing in biotech and, pharma, people who have a passion for science and, who also want to help people. I think that's really important. If you don't like looking at data sets and you don't like trying to, determine whether you think a drug is going to work or not, might not be the best fit. But yeah, really people who care about, drugs that are in development and diligencing those and understanding, whether they could make an impact in people's lives. I think that curiosity and that excitement for science is really, really important. Sort of in addition to that, I would say kind of one of the key important things, I think Peter talks about this a lot, is like generating conviction in ideas and assets. We want to make sure that based on the available data, like we feel strongly that this is, an unconscionable to deny drug for a devastating disease, as Shanshan threw out that acronym earlier. So people who can generate conviction, and then also probably, most or equally importantly, being able to kind of convey that and communicate why this is an awesome opportunity, because you could have it in your head and understand why something's, really impactful. But if you can't then communicate that to the team and make sure that people understand, why is this awesome? What is the what is the bottom line at the top of why this drug should make an impact in patients' lives? It's going to be hard to be a successful associate. So, kind of having that curiosity, being able to kind of generate your own conviction, conveying that to other people, and then also kind of being proactive and finding those opportunities. Like, when you come in as an associate, obviously we give people a disease landscape that they're meant to cover, but I don't say like, okay, Shan, go find 5 companies and come back to me tomorrow and tell me, why one's good and why one's not. Like, it's really Shan going and kind of understanding, asking the right questions and figuring out what are the most compelling opportunities in her space, and kind of proactively bringing that to the attention, working with Laura, thinking about, hey, can we create a investment thesis around this company? So those, I would say, are kind of like the key attributes of what makes a great associate. And then what they kind of go on to do, you've heard from Laura, you've heard from Dan. Those are, within within RA Capital, trajectory that TechAtlas associates can take. I'm still within TechAtlas, but I've kind of, I haven't completely hung up my data, magnifying glass, but I do spend a lot more time managing these days. And then, you also heard Dan talk about people spin out into other companies. Ben Dake, for example, created his own company through the venture team, and then now is running that. People will spin out into our portfolio companies. Sometimes people will spin out into companies outside the RA ecosystem, but they've developed those skills that might make them a really valuable person to do search and evaluation at a large pharma company, or maybe do business development at a smaller, kind of fledgling company. So it gives you the skills not only to really rigorously evaluate the science and evaluate great opportunities, but also, you get visibility into all the other important things that have to do with kind of the biotech ecosystem, which, coming out of grad school, a lot of people might not even know all those opportunities. So I think it is a nice way to kind of learn a lot, and then get exposure to different aspects. So that is, I'm sure there's a million other pathways as well, but those are what are coming to me right now.
That is perfect, and a perfect note to end on. Thank you everyone for joining. Thank you everyone who's on the call. We will see you next month for RATV.
Thank you.